Okay, now we have new suppositions which are much better than the earlier ones. One is adab, the other one is töre, and I would say also örf we can use as the translation of ethics or ethical life. No, not ethical life. Ethical life, I better prefer to translate it as törel yaşam. Okay? Adab is the Persian word for the same, and the örf is the Arabic word for the same. Okay, and it differs from ahlak. Again, I guess originally from Arabic. Okay.
Yeah, can you also make the distinction between morality and ethics?
Yeah, of course. We are gonna make first. I'm gonna make the distinction according to Hegel. Maybe if I like you, if you behave well, okay, I may add some of my own viewpoints as well. Okay, so in his rather again powerful, influential book, The Elements of the Philosophy of Right, translated into English with this title. Okay, The Elements of the Philosophy of Right. Hegel opens up this discussion and insists that morality and ethics should be understood as if they are having different senses. Actually, he confesses that, okay, just like in the case of adab and what it was, örf, for instance, one is Persian, one is Arabic word, okay. Actually, morality and ethics descends from two different languages, originally meaning the same thing, okay. Ethics comes from ancient Greek term ethos, okay, and morality comes from the Latin word mores. Okay, both are meaning nothing else, okay, if you like, social norms, or if you like, habits. Yeah, and if you extend the meaning of habits, what you will arrive is nothing else than the social norms, widely extended, adopted habits in a given society. Okay. Or if you like, let's take a look at first the meaning of this term, norms, within the phrase social norms. Norms have been used in several senses, especially in its legal sense. It primarily refers to the idea of good, actually the Platonic idea of good. Okay? For instance, when the modern law describes itself as normative, it means that it is designed for the good of the society. Okay? It aims at the good of the society. Okay? However, we sociologists do have a better usage for the term norm, okay? Actually, it acts here as if it is the shortened form of the normal, okay? When we say social norms, we imply established patterns of behavior in society, as you know, okay? Civil society, we have said, is the place where Hegel would look for the formation of the ethical life, out of which the state, the emergent state, will derive its laws. Okay? So, but ethical life should be understood as if it is something from the term morality, different from the term morality. Usually in Europe as well, morality, you can rightfully translate the term morality into Turkish as ahlak, no problem with it, okay? In German, it's Moralität. And the German term, which is translated into English as ethical life here, is what was it? Sittlichkeit. Coming from or descending from the root sitten, meaning custom. Okay. Again, established patterns of behavior, customs in a society. Okay. So Hegel says that, especially under the critique developed by Immanuel Kant in his critique of practical reason, actually the meaning of Sittlichkeit has been dissolved under the superabundance of the meaning of the term morality. Okay, so he says that even though these two terms are originally used to mean the same thing, we should now need to distinguish them from each other. Okay, and in this distinction, the term morality falls on the side of the considerations concerning the problem of the good, okay, which is, of course, the task of reason. Okay, it's through your reason you come to think, you come to evaluate what is good, what good must be. Okay, what is, and the difference between what is and what ought to be has been established by these considerations of reason on good. Okay, what is something neutral. Okay, what is turns out to be always an object of critique, because we always tend to develop a certain idea of good. Okay, and what is always falls short from satisfying that idea of good. For instance, let me ask you a question to be able to show the point. What do you think justice is? Now, it appears we don't have any idea. Okay, let's try to give a description in general terms for its meaning. Okay? Distributing what's fair for everyone, or giving everyone their due. But if you come a little bit closer to these definitions and try to find out what they do really mean in that particular situation, you'll find out that they are empty expressions. Beautifully formulated perhaps, but empty expressions. What is the due for anyone, for instance? Okay? What is the deserve of anyone? Okay? Under what conditions, within what contractual situation, etc., etc. Okay? All these needs to be described, and when we start to describe them, you'll find out that we are not going to arrive at an agreement on the practical content of the term, or if you like, meaning of the term justice or good. Okay? What is the universal good for you, in other words, okay, may not be good, the universal good for me. The term universal implying for both of the parties that they may be willing to impose their own idea of good onto others. Okay? Not particular my own good. I am talking about universal good, which means a good for each and everybody else. Okay? And we find out immediately that actually we will never come to an agreement about what this good is, this universal good is. That's the problem. These problems are dealt with within the tradition of morality, so to speak. Okay? Kant's question was about that problem and so on. However, Hegelian conceptualization of Sittlichkeit, translated as ethical life here, has nothing to do with this. Okay? It directly refers to the established habits, or if you like, established patterns of behavior in society. Okay? Now, as you can see, these established habits and what we think the good is or should be may radically be different from each other. Okay? For instance, let me give you an example. I might tell you that to tell lies is something bad. to tell the truth always and all the time is something good. Okay? So I demand you to tell the truth. Okay? But in my practical life, actually in each hour's practical life, the norm is telling lies. Okay? In certain situations. Okay? This means that telling lies is within the structure of the ethical life, while it is denied by morality. Denied and condemned by morality. Okay? So it's quite different, these two things. Okay? Ethical life is exactly what we really do when we are interacting with each other. Okay? Morality is what we think, what we should do when we are interacting with each other. Okay? So they are actually, there's a huge difference between the two. Okay? So Hegel gives his emphasis and preference on the notion of the ethical life as the basis of the civil society, okay? Or if you like, ethical life has been developed out of the interactions taking place in the civil society. Those interactions, some of them, under certain circumstances, tending to repeat themselves continuously and tending to turn into habits. For instance, another example. We may think that the ideal father figure should have such and such characteristics. Should be protective, should be should be sensitive to take care of children, should be thoughtful, should be responsible, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Many characteristics we may set before a father as our demand to satisfy the model of the ideal good. Okay? This concerns the morality part. Okay? However, the real fathers in society, how they act, okay, towards their children, towards their wives, towards their other peers, other fathers, and other individuals, is what is concerned here within the conception of the ethical life. Okay? So, the Sittlichkeit does not take into consideration, as long and as much as Weber once said, the ideal, the notion of the ideal, as that ideal falls short to be realized in actual situations. Okay? So then in ethical life, in the concept of ethical life, what we are really looking is not what we think we do, is not what we think we should do, but is exactly what we really are doing in certain situations. Okay? That's why I told you that it would be much more appropriate to translate it into Turkish as töre and törel yaşam. Okay? Customs or töre in Turkish are nothing else than the established ways of acting or habits of acting under certain circumstances. Okay?
So ethical life changes in the course of time, right? Hegel says.
Of course. Ethical life changes in the course of time. While the society undergoes change, ethical life do change. Our habits do change. For instance, we cannot imagine our habits remaining same once we began to dwell in apartment flats, for instance. Okay? Now, we are no longer dwelling in villages. We are now living in cities, and this enforces upon us a change of habits. Okay? So our habits are changing. While the ideal good does not change. We can, however, within the framework of, through a rather complex relationship actually, if we take the moral ideas within the framework of the ethical life, we can even say that they are also as well subject to change. I can say that what the man thought as the ultimate good in 18th century, 19th century, would not be the same what we now, 21st century people, tending to think as the ultimate good. Okay? They do themselves change. But within the framework of the moral thinking, it turns out to be rather, if not impossible, rather difficult to understand the historical necessity of change, even of the content of the idea of good. But as free from its particular historical social content, you can even say that the moral ideas are ultimate ideas and being not subject to any mutation or change. Okay? Simply because the idea of good hangs over there as the ultimate aim and purpose, and as long as you refrain from assigning any particular content to the idea, you wouldn't need to change the idea. The idea cannot change if it does not have any content at all. Okay? So, Hegel then, emphasizing the ethical life, which produces the rules of acting in society, okay? Finally, these rules giving way to the formation of the state laws, okay, talks about the constitution of the state as the highest ultimate incarnation of the Geists, basing itself upon the entity called society. So then, ethical life turns out to be the dynamic of the production of the state reason. Okay? Therefore, parallel to this Hegelian argument, we would have, for instance, in legal theory, the historical school, okay, which demands that each and every society should develop their own laws, legal system, based upon their own ethical life. Okay? Otherwise, societies would continue to experience contradictions between their ethical lives, the habits prevailing in their ethical lives, and the dictates of the law, okay, which are not driven from their own ethical life and history. Okay? Actually, this is one of the cases that we here in this country are undergoing. Okay? We have the modern laws originating in Western countries, you know, but we have different habits, if you like, than the people living in Western countries. Okay? Now, this creates tiny little problems, one of which can be termed as the problem of corruption, for instance. Okay? In the state offices, actually not only in the state offices, everywhere. Even within our familial relationships, we can talk about the problem of corruption. Why? Because the modern law sets before us the requirement of acting in modern ways. Most of the time we can say that we are being able to do this because now, especially in this early part of the 21st century, we can say that the overwhelming majority of the population now living in cities and under the effect of the process of modernization to this or that degree, okay? Therefore, it can be expected that the overwhelming majority, again to this and that degree, adapts themselves and their ways of acting to the requirements of modernity. Well, another problem shows itself up. The tribal relations, let me say this, okay, the tribal relations based upon the principle of kinship are still prevailing in a rather influential way among us. Okay? Now, these tribal relations enforcing, creating a tension on the individuals. Take a look at the organization of our parties. They are even based upon the tribal organizational model. Okay? Political parties, I mean. Now, this demand sets a peculiar demand which cannot be legally satisfied within the framework of the modern law, which is the demand of the distribution of wealth for the followers, to the followers. Okay? To have followers in such a society, I need to be able to distribute certain wealth, whatever that wealth is. I'm not only talking about wealth in its material sense, okay? It could be a spiritual as well. It doesn't matter, okay? I have to have the control of certain sources which are in demand in the society and should be in the position of controlling their distribution to be able to distribute. And it is this requirement that determines my capacity of having a group of followers or not. Okay? If I'm not in such a position, even the members of my own family do not pay any heed to what I do say. Okay? If I do not have any control over any resource to distribute, even the very members, the most intimate ones of my own family, do not listen to me, do not show any respect to what I say. Okay? So, this logic, however, you know, the requirement of this distribution of resources to the followers, okay, means that not to the totality of the society in an equal way. Okay? Distribution of the resources only to my followers or only to my potential followers. Actually, a situation which is described with none other term than corruption within the framework of the legal modern law. Okay? The examples can easily be multiplied, actually, if you work on this. Okay? You can see those discrepancies of our habits and the demands of the modern law. Okay? For instance, another important demand, which is a must requirement for any possibility of democracy. Okay? That each and every individual should be capable of thinking independently. Now, think about our own society and what percentage could you imagine do this when they use their votes, cast their votes? Even in such an important event as casting our own votes as to decide who's going to govern the country, okay, you'll find out that the overwhelming majority of the constituency do not do that. Okay? So, now, this means that the legal constitution of the country, okay, does not match to the habits of the people living in it. Okay? In that requirement, that awareness in the Hegelian tradition forced them to require law to be developed out of the own ethical life of each country. Okay? So that such differences, such tenuous differences would not develop in a given country. Therefore, Hegel was able to say that for an individual member of that society to counterpose his or her own self against the laws of the state, against the unity of the society, would be impossible. Simply because the state would nothing else than the expression of the ethical life and its unification with the idea of good developed in that society. Okay? So much so far is good enough, I guess, okay, on Hegelian discussion. Do you have any questions about it? Actually, when we proceed, you'll find out that occasionally we return back to these earlier parts of discussion just to remind me that remember somebody else has already told this while we see the same idea within this new framework, okay? We are going to do this, but before, do you have any question? Of course.
Ya hocam şurada bu Geist'in içinde birbirlerine giriyorlardı ya. Onu kısaca bir şey yapabilir misiniz?
The contradiction, the opposition between pure insight and faith, you mean? Okay. Now, in a rather shortest fashion, I can say that the only possibility of basing unity is nothing else than faith. And I've told about the reasons for that, okay? So when pure insight begins to develop in the process of enlightenment, okay, now understanding came into the picture. Now gradually we are in the process of the development of self-consciousness, okay. Consciousness had completed its own development, and self-consciousness develops in a parallel process with the dialectic of master and slave, okay. So here, the opposing party is the introduction of the pure reason or pure rational thinking, pure insight, onto a ground covered by or based upon faith. Okay? So this introduction, this penetration onto the ground of faith actually is what destroys the unity. Okay? So contradicting parties do emerge, each and every one clinging on their own position in the society, display a biased interpretation or gives us a biased interpretation about the whole. This would turn out to be an important problem actually for our later discussion on Lukács, simply because there, you know, in Marxist tradition, one of the basic questions was this, okay? Okay, you tell us that what bourgeoisie is saying, what dominant class is saying was just an ideology, okay, lie, a biased interpretation of the situation of the totality, okay. So, in contrast to the ideology of, however, the bourgeoisie or the dominant class, you claim to rise the truth of the working class. Now, however, as you can see, both within the totality of the society here, okay, if bourgeoisie is biased or the dominant class is biased, okay, working class should also be as well biased, okay, simply because it is one part of the whole as the other is another part of the whole. So each tending to see the whole from their own perspectives, point of views. Therefore, each generating a misguided picture of the whole, a biased picture of the whole. How come you say that bourgeoisie was lying, but what the working class is saying is nothing else but truth? Okay? It turned out to be an important point of discussion in the Marxist tradition, and Georg Lukács tried to respond to this question. Actually, this question has its importance from another respect, for our discussions, recent discussions as well. You know, nowadays political theory is dominated by the theories of hegemony. Okay? Hegemony implying the actually acceptance of the dominant ideology by the disadvantaged groups in the society, okay? So that the dominant group turns out to be capable of making the disadvantaged groups to accept their ideology, their point of view, okay? And through this, they establish a consensus, almost a consensus about the legitimacy of their rule. This is called hegemony, okay? The legal form, an accepted form, consented form of domination, so to speak, okay? Now, however, the problem was this, for Marxists at least, okay? Marxists were talking about the class consciousness, they were saying that working class turns out to be capable of, or it is necessary, if not capable of, it is necessary for the working class to develop a class consciousness for their own, to be able to overthrow the hegemony as well as domination of the bourgeoisie. Okay? So it is through this overthrow they would be capable of overthrowing the capitalist order or capitalist society and establishing a new society, the socialist one. Okay? But the problem was here. Now, to respond to this question, it's told a certain Marxist theory or scientific materialism, historical materialism, whatever you like to call it, had been developed by a certain intelligentsia. Okay? But the problem was that, except the example of the October Revolution, especially in Europe, working class did not respond to this call. Okay? Now, as you can see, now we have a certain set of theory claiming to be scientific, okay, and explaining the truth of the situation of the totality of the society to the disadvantaged class, working class. But working class was rather slow to appreciate, if you like, the value of this theory. Okay? In other words, it proved itself that working class preferred the dominant ideology to accept. Okay? Now, this situation has been called as false consciousness, as you know. The adaptation of the ideology of another class as one's own ideology turns out to be a false consciousness. Now, the problem then is to convince the members of the working class that they are now acting according to a false consciousness. So to be able to get rid of the falsity of that consciousness, they should adhere to the true, real consciousness of the working class. But this did not happen. Okay? As in our country as well, and as in many other countries as well. So how are we gonna overcome this problem? Okay, Lukács was responding to these problems, and these problems were quite practical. Or else, and we can, on a minimal scale, we can formulate the problem in such a way as well. Forget about the class. Think about our own selves as individuals. Hi, for instance, if I was a girl or a boy, how it comes to me, how can it happen that I tend to obey the dictates of my father, even those dictates I know are against me? Okay? That's the basic problem. Okay? And actually concerns each and every one of us. Why do we obey certain dictates, even though sometimes we know that they are against our good? Okay? So to be able to solve and show this puzzle and show the superiority of the working class in understanding and expressing the truth of history, actually adapting this schema of the Hegelian interpretation of history. One more point before leaving Hegel behind. This history, this conceptualization of history is a peculiar conceptualization of history. First of all, let me say this. It starts from a certain point and it aims at arriving at a certain point. Okay? So, its development cannot be explained away by coincidences. Okay? It's a rational process, a dialectical process, and all the points of its moments, as Hegel calls them, okay? All its moments were there, even at the very beginning in its embryonic form. Okay? So what's at stake here? A subject unfolding itself in a gradual dialectical process. Okay? Unfolding itself means what it will be, into what it would develop itself, has already been determined from the very beginning. Okay? It would develop itself to be one with its own self, to the point where it can be one with its own self. You know, it has been split already with the appearance of the consciousness. Okay? This means that to be one with its own self means that knowledge and being would coincide with each other. Okay? In other words, the aim of the university, remember, spirit, knowledge is understood as spirits expressing its own self to its own self. Okay? So there is no alienation, and at that moment on, Hegel would start to construct his own peculiar philosophy, simply because up until now, we are in the process of arriving at the formation of this possibility of what you would call absolute knowledge. Okay? As for the whatness of the spirit, you can interpret it in three ways, each actually corresponding to the three ideas of the Kantian reason, okay? Unity of all, unity of the world, unity of the subject, unity of the object. As well, they correspond in Christian terminology to God, Holy Spirit, and the human God, Jesus Christ, okay? Now, by saying this, we can leave Hegel behind and return back to our introduction to the Lukács problem. So the problem was that in modern societies, even though the society has been split into two antagonistic classes, how come one of them, working class, can come to represent the truth of the totality of the society? In other words, practically formulated, the question deals with the problem of why should I prefer what Marx says rather than what my government says? Okay? Why should I prefer and take as truth what Marx says rather than as Keynes was saying, for instance? Or rather than Süleyman Demirel was saying, okay? Rather than the principles of liberal democracy, for instance, why should I prefer the Marxist ideology or theory or scientific socialism? Okay? That was the basic problem. And Lukács thought that he was able to find a hint in the Hegelian discussions to show the superiority of the working class point of view and its capacity to represent the totality. First of all, his argument starts by stating a certain peculiarity of the modern capitalist society. Okay? And he was right, I did, on that point. Okay? It's for the first time, with the rise of the capitalist society, okay, there begins to be possible for the members of that society to move within the different and between and among the different segments of that society. Okay? That society is a highly integrated society in comparison to the earlier forms of societies, which in Lukács' mind, at least following Marx here, okay, are the feudal society and slave society and primitive commune. Okay. Okay. With the exception of the primitive commune, where no division of labor and where no differentiation or stratification show themselves to a considerable significant degree. Okay, these two are class societies in which the classes are separated from each other with rather sharp, strict boundaries. Okay, for instance, feudal society and slave societies the classes are legally separated from each other, not only economically. While in modern capitalist societies, the class division based upon the economic differences, so there being no legal or political barriers for the individual members to move from one class to another, which we call today social mobility, you know, upper or vertical social mobility. With respect to the question of then vertical social mobility, you can say that, vertical and horizontal as well, the modern capitalist society is a much more flexible, open society, which means that it allows both the frequent interaction of the classes among themselves as well as frequent movement of individuals from one class to another. Okay? This was one of the requirements for the Lukácsian arguments, because for the first time with the rise of the capitalist society, it turns out to be possible, not actually, possible to see the totality, the truth of the totality of that society. Okay? For the first time in history then, the capitalist society is the society whose truth of totality can be seen, or seeing the truth of totality is possible. Fine. However, this is a required peculiarity, but is not enough for the Lukácsian argument, simply because for the Lukácsian argument to culminate to its intended point, okay, we need assign a spatial status to one of the classes. Of course, and understandably, as you can easily guess, this class having these spatial characteristics would turn out to be the working class. Okay? Lukács would say that for the first time again in history, working class turns out to be capable of understanding the truth of the totality of the society because for the first time working class or labor as alienated labor turns out to be capable of occupying the position of the object on the one hand, while as human labor turns out to be again capable to occupy the position of the subject also. Okay. This means that practically working class as human labor acting in the capacity of subject, okay, turns out to be the same as alienated labor now reduced to the status of the object. This practically means that only labor in capitalist society, okay, turns out to be capable of occupying both of the positions available. The position of the subject and the position of the object, okay? You know, as for labor, first, the problem of its alienation. You know, labor, what's labor? Our doings on things, okay? Labor, it's true labor. Actually, it's a, if you like, bourgeois theory of labor developed primarily by John Locke himself, okay? A liberal theory of labor, okay? Based upon the classical theory of action. We are here, and through our acting, or if you like, within this new context, through our labor, we express our own selves on nature, okay? As you can see, what ourselves implies here, the internal inner being of my nature, okay, which is expressed through my acting activities, taking these things from here, putting them there, etc., talking to you, realizes itself on the externality, which is called nature, okay? So it is exactly the process of the production at the same time, okay? Now, however, this labor, under the conditions of the capitalist society, has been alienated from its products, okay? In other words, the modifications it achieves in nature has been alienated from that labor. In other words, the capitalist, to put it shortly and practically, the capitalist appropriates, okay, the products of labor. I'm working at the factory as a shoemaker, okay, but the owner of the factory owns the shoes that I produce, okay? So these shoes that I produce, in other words, turns out to be some objectified form, in their objectified form, stand against me. Rather than making life easy for me, in other words, okay, they rather make life difficult for me, okay? I had to work extra hours to be able to have one pair of them, for instance, okay? And I have to compete for it for the other workers, the capitalist, the owner of the factory, etc., okay? This alienated, objectified labor turns against, in other terms, against the laborer himself, okay? Now, this means one of the aspects of alienation is undergoing here. The labor, my own product, the product of my own efforts had left me and turned against me as something petrified, or in Lukácsian terms, reified, reification. Reification Türkçe? Şeyleşmek. Okay, now this means that as alienated labor, therefore, as product, if you like, the product was alienated labor, nothing else. As alienated labor within the conditions of the capitalist society, I am the object. Okay? I occupy the object position in the relations of knowledge, because we are talking about the question of who knows better the totality. Okay? So I occupy the position of the object here. But as the worker, I still retain my human capacity, on the other hand, and by retaining this human capacity, I still do have the capacity to occupy the subject position, on the other hand. Okay? This means that I am now, as human worker and alienated labor, okay, occupying the two poles of the knowledge relationship. Okay? The subject of knowledge and object of knowledge. Therefore, the truth shows itself to me in its totality, okay? Because I am in both of the positions of the knowledge relationship, okay? Just like Hegel was saying, okay? The process was aiming at the folding of the Geist onto itself to become one with its own self, okay? And the knowledge at that stage is understood as the expression of the spirit as the expression of the spirit of its own self to its own self. Yani kendimin kendime ekspresyonu ifadesi olarak anlaşılır. It is no longer a representation of an alienated object, remember, in the mind of the subject, okay? The question of knowledge, after this unification of the spirit had been achieved, okay, the question of knowledge can no longer be formulated in terms of a representational relationship. Now, from then on, Hegel would begin to talk about the absolute knowledge, indeed, okay? Not a relationship of representation any longer. Why? Because Geist is now expressing itself to itself in the form of knowledge. That's all, okay? That's simple. So, this process, as you can see, can be realized by the agency occupying both of the questions. I am expressing myself to myself. I am expressing myself to myself. Okay? No longer a relationship of representation. And Lukács, by establishing such kind of logic, okay, would proceed to claim the superiority of the working class theory, while talking about the theory of the dominant classes as ideology and its relation to the working class as false consciousness. Okay, the problem of consciousness then is to arrive at the truth of the knowledge of the truth of the totality, okay, on the part of the working class. And by making leverage with this knowledge, okay, the overthrow, the hegemony of the bourgeois ideology. That was Georg Lukács. I intended to start with few introductory remarks to our discussion of Nietzsche. Our time is up. I'm sorry.